50G crash during the 2026 Japanese Grand Prix, which luckily left him with only bruising injuries. Many drivers have raised their concerns once again around this year's regulations and the speed differentials we see between cars on different parts of the circuit, mainly due to the varying battery levels and electric power deployment from the battery half of the power unit. The crash took place because coming out of turn 9 and through turn 10 in Suzuka, Ollie Bearman's Haas was traveling around 35 to 45 kilometers per hour faster than the Alpine of Franco Colapinto. I know that
Formula One has just seen a 50G crash, and rather than pointing fingers at the driver, the entire grid turned its focus on the rules. When Oliver Bearman lost control at Suzuka, it seemed like a basic error at first, until drivers began voicing concerns. Now the paddock stands divided, tensions are climbing, and one uneasy thought is spreading fast. What if this wasn't just a single incident, but the first signal of something far more serious?
I don't think a lot of people realize how serious Ollie Bearman's injuries could be following his terrifying 50G crash in Suzuka. And this whole thing is just further evidence of the fact that the FIA does not care about the long-term safety and well-being of its drivers. I'm about to give the FIA their medical lashings for the third year in a row, not only because driver safety is something that is very personally important to me, but because this is within my field of expertise, like my actual educational field of expertise. First, we need to talk about Ollie's crash specifically. Now, many people have posted and talked about this clip where Ollie is limping with the marshals and he is really reducing the weight that he's bearing through his right leg.
It was meant to define the future of Formula One, a cleaner, sharper, more advanced era where technology was supposed to make racing faster, safer, and somehow more consistent. Yet instead, it turned the grid into a high-speed guessing game where one car feels like a rocket ship and the one ahead suddenly becomes a moving chicane with no warning whatsoever. Because 48 hours before the crash, the drivers had already sensed it coming.
You've got a situation now where you have to make changes because of the Bearman crash being the realization of the fears that the drivers were voicing right from the start of the year. It's no longer teams seemingly complaining because they don't have a competitive advantage, or drivers complaining because they're not used to driving cars like this and they're having to relearn the way in which they drive. They're actually able now to come together under the auspices of safety and say, you have to bring the changes because this is dangerous. And it's just been proven. Everything we've been saying has now been proven.
They sat in that Suzuka briefing room, stared the stewards in the eye, and essentially said, this is going to end badly. Not in a vague, careful, corporate manner, but in the very direct language of people who know what 300 kilometers per hour truly feels like when something goes wrong.
If Bearman's crash would have happened in the likes of Vegas or Baku, it would have been a lot worse. And can you explain why?
Well, I'll tell you for why. Crashing into Tech Pro or crashing into tyres like we had with Ollie Bearman at the weekend, you can imagine is physically different than crashing into Armco, or in some cases around street circuits, it's a concrete wall. They don't give. There is nothing that actually takes the energy and dissipates the energy. And it's that if a crash happens over a long distance, then it looks spectacular, but it's actually not too bad.
And then, almost as if the sport was eager to validate those claims without delay, it happened. At the Japanese Grand Prix, buried within the pack where cameras seldom choose to focus, Oliver Bearman was pursuing Franco Colapinto through Spoon Curve, one of Suzuka's most demanding sections.
Crazy, or was the Japanese Grand Prix kinda dangerous? Hear me out. I thought Suzuka was gonna be a snooze fest under the 2026 regulations. Lots of battery management, processional racing, and for the first 20 laps it kind of was. Mercedes rocket ship, clearing everyone, and then lap 22 happened. Ollie Bearman has a 50G crash into the barrier, and he was seen limping and holding his ankle. I hope he's okay. And when I saw the replay, I was like, wait, what just happened? Franco Colapinto was harvesting energy on the straight, slowing down to recharge his battery, downshifting on the straight, and Ollie Bearman was catching up at full speed.
This was not a glamorous fight for podium positions or championship points. It was 18th against 17th, the kind of battle that usually fades into the background of a race, except this time, it did not disappear. Bearman was hurtling at around 308 kilometers per hour, fully committed, pushing hard, and then suddenly, the car ahead was not merely slower, it was drastically slower. Colapinto's Alpine, depleted of its electric boost, was limping at roughly 263 kilometers per hour. That is a 45 kilometer per hour difference between he veered left to avoid the slower car, but the instant his front wheels hit the grass at that speed, control ceased to exist. The car snapped violently, tore through the braking markers, and rocketed back across the track as if fired from a cannon. What followed was physics doing exactly what physics always does when humans overreach. The car smashed into the barrier sideways at 50G. Not a soft impact, not a grazing hit, but a savage, full-force collision that disintegrated the car around the survival cell and sent carbon fiber across spoon curve like confetti at the worst possible celebration. And here is where it becomes unsettling, because the crash was not triggered by rain, nor by mechanical failure, nor even by a traditional driver error. It was caused by the rules.
Some reports have been saying that the speed differential was up to 90 kilometers per hour, mainly due to screenshots like this, but to be honest, the telemetry data this year is all over the place and also needs to be fixed by Formula One. For example, this was the telemetry for the two cars the lap before the crash, and do you really think Ollie is flat out through the first 5 corners? But anyway, Ollie went left to avoid hitting Franco and lost control of his Haas car as it went over the grass, then hitting into the wall on the outside of the turn 11 hairpin, which has led to a statement from the FIA saying that they understand the contribution of high closing speeds in Bearman's crash and that these rules will be looked into by the FIA.
3 months ago, those same rules arrived amid the fanfare of a revolution. The 2026 power units were hailed as the ultimate fusion of performance and sustainability, a 50-50th split between internal combustion and electric power, promising to redefine Formula One. Half engine, half battery, all innovation. On paper, it sounded flawless. On the track, it produced a problem no one could ignore at 300 kilometers per hour. Energy deployment was no longer constant. Under these regulations, cars gain or lose electric power depending electric boost, while the car ahead had none. One driver was hitting a temporary turbo, the other coasting on reduced output. That single imbalance turned a manageable gap into a closing speed of nearly 50 kilometers per hour in seconds. The most dangerous element wasn't the speed, it was the unpredictability. No visual signal, no indicator, no flashing light warns whether the car ahead is fully charged or running on empty. From behind, every car looks identical, even if one is about to surge while the other fades. Drivers discover the truth the hard way, as the gap vanishes far faster than anticipated.
Yeah, the other one that is one that we feared going into the season, now we have started to see, which is a big crash, and Ollie Bearman involved in that. A lot of people over-celebrating in many ways. Thank goodness he wasn't hurt more, Scafey. But fair dinkum, let's go through the DNA of this thing, because this is a world of pain.
Well, look, we've been saying it, Paul, the whole time. The speed differential of the cars is just too much. Now, this was just an instance where he's come out of the corner and coming up in behind Colapinto, he actually did.
By the time their brain registers it, the corner is already looming. By the time their foot responds, the margin has already vanished. By the time they grasp what is happening, the crash is already inevitable. And that is precisely why the drivers had sounded the alarm before Suzuka. This was no sudden surprise. It had been emerging since pre-season testing in Bahrain, where teams first noticed these strange, unpredictable speed variations. Drivers reported moments when cars ahead seemed to drop anchor mid-corner, not from error, but because the energy system demanded it. They flagged it again in Australia. They flagged it again in the driver's briefing at Suzuka. They spoke of closing speeds, blind spots in the system, and the harsh reality that wheel-to-wheel racing is unsafe when two cars can perform completely differently at the same point on track. And then 48 hours later, the exact scenario they warned about unfolded in real time at 50G. The reaction from the grid was immediate and intense. Drivers were not surprised. That was the most revealing part. There was no confusion, no frantic attempts to understand. Instead, there was frustration, because this was exactly what they had predicted. Members of the Grand Prix Drivers Association stressed that this had been coming for months. The problem was not confined to qualifying laps or rare events.
And this got me worried. They're approaching a corner and Bearman realizes, oh no, I'm gonna hit him. Swerves a bit to avoid the collision. Yes, maybe Franco had a part in it as well. And goes straight into the barrier. 50 G's of impact, a potential ankle injury. And he did everything right and still crashed. And here's what got me. Bearman's been one of the most vocal drivers about not being the biggest fan of these regulations. He's talked about how unpredictable the energy stuff makes the racing. And now this happens? We have 5 weeks until Miami now. So will anything actually change?
Some drivers went further, questioning whether the sport had truly learned from its own history. Formula One has spent decades enhancing safety, introducing innovations like the Halo, the HANS device, and advanced crash structures that have saved countless lives. Yet now it was creating a new type of risk, not from driver error or mechanical failure, but from the rulebook itself. The frustration was not only emotional, it was rational. If safety had justified so many regulatory changes before, why was it suddenly sidelined for these power unit rules? Silence from the top only worsened matters. The official response acknowledged acknowledged that high closing speeds were a factor, but framed the incident as part of ongoing data collection. Meetings were scheduled. Engineers began exploring solutions, including improved rear light systems to indicate a car's power state and adjustments to energy deployment strategies to reduce extreme speed differences. Yet even those fixes raised uneasy questions, because if a system needs extra signals just to be safe, perhaps the system itself is flawed.
Bearman came out right behind Franco Colapinto. The closing speed between the two cars was measured at around 50 km/h. That's not marginal, that's extreme. He then took avoiding action, lost the car, hit the barriers hard, hurt his right knee, but was later cleared by the medics. And he's okay, which is of course the main thing. Talking about the crash later on, Ollie said it was a scary moment out there. There was a massive overspeed, around 50 km/h, which is a part of these...
And that brings us back to that moment at Spoon Curve, because the most unsettling aspect of Bearman's crash isn't the number itself, even though 50G ranks among the most severe impacts in recent Formula One history. It's why it happened. Traditionally, the sport's worst accidents stem from collisions, weather, or mechanical failures. They are sudden, chaotic, and often unavoidable in the heat of racing. This one was different. This one was foreseeable. It had been flagged in advance. In many ways, it was almost engineered. Yet despite the brutality of the impact, Bearman emerged. He climbed from the wreck, limping slightly, with nothing more than a bruised knee. Over the radio, he even apologized to his team before checking on himself, a testament to the mindset of a Formula One driver. The survival cell held. The halo did its job. Crash structures absorbed the energy exactly as intended. Every safety device functioned perfectly, which only made it more ironic. The car performed flawlessly, the rules did not. That's why Paddock anger didn't fade after the race. If anything, it intensified, because everyone realized the next crash might not occur at a track like Suzuka with wide runoff zones. It could happen on a street circuit, somewhere like Baku or Singapore, where walls hug the racing line and leave no room for error. And as drivers imagined that, the discussion shifted from frustration to genuine alarm.
That's why I was so surprised, when they said, no, we will sort out qualifying and leave the racing alone, because it's exciting. As drivers, we've been extremely vocal that the problem is not only qualifying, it's also racing, and we've been warning that this kind of accident was always going to happen. Here we were lucky there was a escape road. Now imagine going to Baku or going to Singapore or going to Vegas and having this kind of closing speeds and crashes next to the walls.
Because the line between a frightening crash and a devastating one often comes down to mere inches. The meeting scheduled for April 9th suddenly became one of the season's most crucial discussions. FIA officials, Formula One executives, team representatives, and engine suppliers would gather to determine the next steps. Options were already being considered. Some engineers proposed a minimum power threshold to prevent cars from dropping below a certain performance level. Others suggested capping or eliminating the overtake boost responsible for the most extreme speed gaps. There were talks about standardizing energy deployment on certain track sections to reduce unpredictability. Every solution carried compromises, because adjusting power balance impacts everything from lap times to passing chances. Yet the core debate wasn't about speed, it was about accountability. Because the pressing question over that meeting wasn't whether changes would happen, it was whether they would have been implemented without a 50G wake-up call. And that question lingers long after the debris is cleared. Formula One has always been a sport that reacts to its own failures.
50G shunt. Now just play that out. If you go to a place like Baku or Miami or Vegas or anywhere where you can't, Singapore, where you can't see around the corner, that's a much bigger shunt.
And there's
right?
no runoff.
And there's no runoff, exactly.
Straight into wall.
So the second thing about that is I bumped into Carl Reindler this morning at the airport. Carl Reindler was the guy from the FIA and Motorsport Australia who actually was at the scene of that crash.
Wow.
And he said it was a very, very big shunt. His comment straight away was...
Now the sport finds itself in a familiar tension, trapped between innovation and consequence, struggling to determine if progress is worth the risks it brings. The 2026 regulations were intended to shape Formula One's future. Instead, they have ignited one of the fiercest internal debates the sport has faced in years: drivers versus rulemakers. Experience versus theory, reality versus design. At the heart of it all is a single moment at Suzuka, where a 20-year-old driver struck a wall at 50G, walked away, and inadvertently forced the entire sport to confront whether it had advanced too far, too fast, in the wrong direction, has never truly faced before invisible performance. For decades, drivers could read one another. Grip levels, engine power, braking points, even confidence could be sensed from the car ahead. Racing was perilous, but at least somewhat predictable within human instinct and mechanical limits. Now that instinct is eroding. Under these rules, the car ahead is no longer a steady benchmark. It can gain or lose enormous performance in seconds, depending on how its energy system operates at that exact instant. This means the fundamental language of racing, the unspoken conversation between drivers at speed, has been profoundly disrupted.
You might be asking yourself, why is FIA getting blamed for Ollie Bearman's crash at the Japanese Grand Prix? The answer just has to do with the new regulations. With the new battery deployment strategies, it's causing for inconsistent speeds at the same parts of the track for different drivers. Because drivers have to recharge their battery, it causes them to have to go slower at certain points of the track, but there still are other cars on track that are going super quickly. It's a pretty big difference of these speeds at the same parts on track. The drivers that are going faster to have to swerve out of the way to avoid a crash. This obviously becomes dangerous because there's a car that's going really fast and needs to avoid a slower moving car. And this is something that Ollie had to do in order to avoid a crash with Colapinto.
And when that language fails at 300 kilometers per hour, the consequences are not hypothetical. They are immediate. This is why some drivers have begun describing the current racing as more of a gamble than a contest. You are no longer just calculating your own braking point. What complicates it further is that the spectacle, at least outwardly, appears thrilling. Cars converging rapidly, sudden overtakes, unexpected shifts in pace. It generates drama, it generates chaos, and for viewers unaware of the underlying mechanics, it can seem like innovation functioning exactly as intended. But inside the cockpit, it feels entirely different. Because the same unpredictability that excites the audience creates danger for the drivers. So instead of solving it, they are managing it. And managing risk is not the same as removing it. That is why the pressure on the April decisions is unlike anything seen in recent seasons. This is not about shaving a tenth of a second or discovering a clever aerodynamic trick. This is about redefining the boundaries of what is acceptable in wheel-to-wheel racing. And the next time it happens, the outcome might not be as forgiving as a scraped knee and a lucky escape, which is exactly why the entire grid is no longer asking for adjustments. They are demanding answers,